Hey, Karen,
Hello.
how are you?
I'm good. I'm so happy to be talking with you today.
Oh, gosh, I'm happy to be talking with you as well about a topic that is so essential and yet scary for so many of us.
It is.
It
But I
really
think
is.
it's scary because it feels like this amorphous thing hanging out there, like anything. When we feel like we don't know how to do it, it just looms bigger and bigger. And once you realize there's steps and there's things you can do, it becomes so much more manageable.
It's true. And I will say your book is really effective in that it really gives an architecture for storytelling. I want to start though, there's all these old chestnuts about how people are so scared about public speaking. They'd rather be the one in the coffin at the funeral than giving the eulogy and
Yeah.
yada yada.
Yeah.
But what's your opinion about why we as essential human beings feel scared to stand up and own the room?
I think there's a couple reasons. First is neurological. When you are standing up and looking at everyone, and everyone's eyes are looking at you, and you're looking in a different direction, your brain is like, danger, danger, you are missing something. Why aren't you looking where they're looking? Like, hey, you're crazy. You're missing something here. And so, because your brain feels like there is something not normal here, there's something not right, it's going to start to release dopamine and adrenaline. I'm sorry, it's going to release cortisol and adrenaline and help you focus because it's saying this is potentially dangerous. We need to be able to respond and get out of it. So, right away, your ability to come up calm and clear headed and to be able to think as easily as you do in a conversation with your friend, it's immediately changed. So
Hmm.
there's this whole neurological aspect to it that is real and valid. And these are the nerves that we feel like, yeah, you are having shifts in your body. That is true. You pair that with this fear of, I'm going to get up there and I'm not going to remember what to say because that's going to be the worst thing ever. And it's not. Like we
Mm.
have all blanked in moments in life.
Well, you blanked during a TED
I
Talk.
did. I did. It's a story in there to demonstrate that at the time it felt like the worst thing. And we can get into that if that's helpful. But really, what I learned from the whole experience as the story continues is that it didn't make me unrelatable. It made me more human and authentic and more
Mhm.
warm and approachable. Like our fear of public speaking is thinking it is perfection and being eloquent and always having the words and the gestures and the postures and all the things that we make these assumptions about. And really, a great talk is how you make your audience feel, which is going to be you being genuine and warm and authentic.
Say more about that. Do you think that one of the questions I always ask if I'm engaging with a client about a talk or something is like, what do you want the audience to get out of this? Um, which is similar to like I want to know that as a speaker, as your speaker who you're paying for, how do you want me to make people feel?
Yeah. Yeah. I actually just wrote an article about this because
Ah.
I play the flute and the piccolo in a concert band where it's a community band, nothing fancy, but we put on concerts every now and then. And we just did one a few weeks ago. It was Dancing Through the Decades. We were playing songs from every decade. It was our era's tour, except it was things like Duke Ellington and Benny Goodman
Oh, love
and
it.
Moulin Rouge and Chicago. And so it was like all these different decades. And a concert's a concert. You say it, you watch the musicians on stage, you applaud. Like there's not a ton to look at. Um, this group average age probably like 75, right? A lot of white hair in the audience. And so they're pretty reserved until we got to this song that I hate, which was a medley from the movie Shrek.
Oh God.
Say no more, right? In this particular medley, the song YMCA is played twice. And I hate for sharing. In fact, in music, there's often things where they want you to like clap and snap and whistle. And I'm like, I suddenly become like very preoccupied with my instrument. I have no interest. And so to me, YMCA is like for sharing, except, worse. I get that so many people love it. Exactly. And I love that for you. If this is your thing, I love
Just
that for you. It is not for me. But we get to this song and the room erupts and these people are standing up and they're stomping and they're clapping and the energy level went up 10 points. We get to the end of this and I was like, I'll be darned. We just went through this concert and played
Right.
some really lovely pieces. And what are they going to remember? They're going to remember Shrek because they had this experience and it made them feel good and they wanted to be a part of something. And so when you're telling a story, when you're communicating or presenting, it's not just the information you're sharing, it's how are you making that audience feel? Because you could give the most insightful information, but if they don't want to learn or they don't want to listen or they don't feel like they're engaging in any way, then it's failed. So you have to start with that feeling of what do you want people to come away with? Because that's what they're going to remember.
Shay's very funny. I love that for you. Thank you. I love it for me that I can do the YMCA.
Yeah.
And listeners, bring us your questions. Karen is one of the world's experts on telling story for leadership to connect, to get what you want, to help other people get what they want. So bring it on. So Karen, you just told me a story there. What were you trying what did you telling me that story do besides, get me feeling all fun because I got to do my arms
Yeah.
that
So a couple.
that other things couldn't?
Yeah. So a couple of things. So I intentionally tell this story using YMCA, which by the way, never told this before, hot off the press. Most people are familiar with the song and the arm gestures, and they have some type of emotion about it. So by using this, I'm anchoring to something that you know, which is so helpful in storytelling because it's like immediately putting a fully formed idea in your head. You don't even have to stop and imagine, like, what would it feel like to make these letters and to do these things? We've all done it, and some of us love it and some of us don't. And so I'm immediately
Ah.
putting you in a place and an emotion and a connection where you have a feeling about it. And then you start to think, you're right. I don't remember the other 12 songs played at a concert. I do remember doing this. I do remember when I've experienced it. And so it not only is connecting you to what you know and it's starting to evoke some emotion, it is also making your brain spend a little bit of calories because it was like, okay, I didn't expect her to start whipping out the YMCA, but all right, let's go. And so there's all these different things that start pulling the attention in your brain just from that story.
You talk about the role that dopamine plays in storytelling. Tell us a little bit about that.
And it's really paired with oxytocin because what happens when
And explain why that's good.
when I'm telling a story or whenever any of us are listening to a storyteller, we have this feeling almost like this person trusts me enough to share this. Like
Mhm.
they're being vulnerable and our brain senses that they're vulnerable. And by the way, vulnerable doesn't mean you're sharing the most private thing. It just means like, okay, you're being really real here. And now my brain feels like, wow, you trust me enough to say that. And it's giving this reward of this mixture of dopamine and oxytocin. It is not anything that can be injected. It's not commanded. It just happens in response. The more empathy you have for the storyteller and what they're sharing, the more oxytocin that's released. The more oxytocin that's released, the more trust that you have. So, like in work settings, when you want to create psychological safety on a team, stepping back as a team and sharing stories and weaving them into your meetings and your retreats and all of that helps lay this foundation and this strength because as all of this happens, the brain has this feeling of like these people are safe to be around and we're all a member of an in group and we feel belonging and we want that.
Interesting. And the bonding hormone is released.
Yeah. Magical. Yep.
When was the moment in your career that you realized story was powerful?
Yeah, probably the most defining moment was like the most awkward business dinner. So I am an introvert and like a socially awkward introvert, where if you make me go to a dinner, I'm an introvert and an empath, right? So if you make me go to a dinner and you notice my choice of words there, I said make me, that's truly an
Mhm,
introvert
mhm.
speaking. I am going to be feeling uncomfortable if there's not conversation, but I'm also like not the one to necessarily lead the conversation. And so it's this tension of I was at this business dinner where we didn't know each other, a group of people coming together from different companies to discuss working together. And we are all silently dying inside because
Mm.
no one can think of anything to say. Like you're fiddling with your glass, you're
God,
looking at
that's
all, it's
terrible.
awful. And we've
Oh.
all had it, but
Mhm.
like you get stuck and you can't get out of it. And you're like looking at the other tables longingly, like, will someone
Well,
please?
except no, here's the thing. Here's the
Yeah.
thing. Here's why you do want me there and you don't want me there is that my anxiety takes over. And so in that situation, I would be the one who said something, but I'd probably say something inappropriate and like too much. or I'd blurt things and then everyone would be like, oh God, maybe we should be silent. But I don't know if anyone out there is listening and is also like me, a little bit anxious, but also introverted and like
Yeah.
it would feel the need to take care of everyone and close up that gap, but maybe not do
Yeah.
it in the most elegant possible way.
Yeah, so I have that same need. I just don't necessarily come up with what to say. But I think we all have that moment where we're like, oh, this is awkward and the silence must be filled. What do we do? And fortunately, at this dinner, this man named Aaron just clears his throat and says, so I'm building a deck on the back of my house. And we're all like, okay, this is not what we thought for a business dinner, but someone's talking, so let's go
Right.
with it. And he's talking about how he had to relocate this wood pile to be able to do the framing of the deck. And he's stacking them in a wheelbarrow, moving them to the side to restack them and coming back. And he's on the third load, takes a log off and is face to face with a raccoon. And he's frozen. And the raccoon actually freezes in the same position because neither were expecting. And they're both like, what do we do? And so he said they hold this in a drawer, and it's hilarious because the raccoons have that almost bandit thing, and they're like, so he slowly backs up and the raccoon runs off. And this story just broke the ice because we're all now laughing. We're asking him questions about this raccoon, which who cares about the raccoon? But we're like, thank goodness someone is sharing this story. And then more people started sharing stories of unwanted house guests, and it created this connection. So we went from this awkward business dinner where we're exploring working together, and we're all probably a little defensive of like, I don't want a sales pitch, I don't really want to be here, to now, okay, we're actually enjoying each other and we're having a nice dinner and we're having fun. And Aaron just did that with a story that actually had nothing to do with business. It was a story that made him relatable and made us relatable. And that's when I realized like it's not just this thing for presentations or for big moments. It's a way to really connect and shift energy.
How can people who have social anxiety use story to connect? I mean, my instinct is always to tell people to just ask a lot of questions. I'm like always channel your inner journalist. People love to talk about themselves. So if you're feeling anxious, just ask people questions. But you're suggesting something a little bit different.
Yeah, I think both questions are great because questions can help you get to a story. So if you're in a moment where your mind is blank and you can't think of something, questions are an amazing way to start to get to something where you get there. I go into settings like a networking event where I know someone, I go in with what I call the back pocket story. And so this is a little bit planned where I know I'm going to be in a setting where I'm going to be meeting people for the first time and I'm probably going to have to speak. Probably not going to be able to just hug the wall and, do the polite
Mhm.
nod at people. And so sometimes you need to have some way to do that. And so maybe it's about a book I've read or an adventure I've just had. I heard someone give a really great suggestion that if you're at a networking event and someone comes up to you and says, how's your day? Don't just say good. Give a sentence like, I had an amazing latte this morning because that creates a different type of engagement and energy and shift. And so if you feel this pressure where these situations make you feel uncomfortable, come in with a couple things in your back pocket. Come in with a brief story, come in with a sentence or a phrase, because what do we always get asked? Have you been to these before? Where do you work? Well, what are some of the things you're working on? What are you reading? Like, come prepared with a couple of sentences that's going to help move the conversation along and make it less awkward, because when you're asking questions, you're driving the conversation. But sometimes when you tell a story, you're giving enough so that others take and run and reciprocate with stories, and it takes the pressure off you.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you, Shay. Shay says it's a huge reason Morris Post recently kept my attention. I told a story. Yes, I told a story about how I was at a meeting with my publisher and they gave me good news and I couldn't hear it. And thank you. I appreciate that, Shay. But I am someone who overshares almost by habit. And so I always feel like I'm scared to tell stories sometimes because I'm like, was that too much? So that's interesting. So
Can
my
we talk
question,
about that
yes,
though? Because I think
please.
other people have that, right? Because I get this quite a bit. I work with Fortune 500 companies and leaders who will say, I don't want to share that. That's private. In fact, I was working with a member of a C-suite team where she was the only female on this team of men. They were about 15 years older, getting ready for a big offsite meeting, working on her presentation. And she said, I do not want to tell a story that has anything to do with me or my family, because I feel like they're just so much older. Their children aren't in the home. I don't feel like they played an
Right.
active
I don't
role.
want them to think of their daughter when they're listening to me, basically.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. And that's totally fine. What I always say is that personal doesn't mean private. So every story you tell is personal, meaning you are bringing your perspective. Only you can tell the story the way you're telling it. If two people told it, someone else would tell it differently. And so you want to bring the story that you can tell, even if you're telling a story about someone else. It is always personal. But it doesn't mean that it's private where you're sharing things that don't feel comfortable. So I have a pretty high privacy barrier. I don't really tell stories about my family, but I will happily tell you stories about mistakes or blanking on a TED stage or things that other people would be like, oh my gosh, you can't say that. Each person is going to have a different line for what is personal and what is private. And so I always encourage, like, if you start to feel uncomfortable about something, and it's not just I'm nervous to tell a story, but it's like, yeah, no, I wouldn't want to share that, then okay, that's your boundary.
That's
Think
your
about what's
boundary.
private and then get just on the other side of it.
That's your boundary. How do you know when a story's good? I mean, no offense.
Mhm.
I talk to a lot of people and I hear a lot of like boring stories and I'm just like, whoa, do I really? And sometimes you're at the networking event and you're like, oh, that's so cool you had a latte. But on the other hand, I'm like, I don't give a shit if you had a latte.
Right, right,
So
right.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's true. So there's two answers. One is you don't. You can do all the work and all the steps and really be thoughtful about how are you engaging the brain in the story and have you tested it, and you still won't know how it lands because maybe the room you're in is really cold, or maybe the person you're talking to didn't sleep last night, or maybe they're really hungry, and your story just, you don't know if it's landing the way you want. But I don't like to idle there because that's true for anything in life. Like, we
Mhm,
just don't know.
mhm.
So I try to focus more on like work the process, start developing it, put some space in, come back to it, test it with people. Usually when a story resonates, you see something physically. If you can see the person, there's
Yeah.
some type of interest and engagement. Sometimes they even look away because you're making them think of a story that it prompted. And so
Oh,
they're off
that's
like,
interesting.
looking
Oh,
away is not bad, especially if you do like keynotes or presentations. It's not bad if you lose the eye connection of the audience because you want people having their own stories. It's when you lose the body language and they're disengaged and they look
mm,
away. That's the problem. You
or
can
look at their
generally tell.
phone.
Yeah. Well, it's hard because so many people take notes on their phones, but you generally see that body language. People will raise, you tell a story, they raise you a story, meaning they start to share a story of what yours prompted them to think about. That's
Mhm.
often a big piece of it. There's just this general excitement, or people ask you questions about it, or they say things like, I like your story. And when you dig to understand what did you like about it, they'll share some specific examples.
Okay, so let's just get practical here because I like to
Yeah.
get practical. So I'm really anxious because I have a speech I have to give, and I don't know how to make it connect. How do I how do I know what story to tell? How do I build that story? I mean, you gave me your time. This I'll be forever grateful, and you helped me with a keynote I was going to give, and you were like, you really need to open with a story. You need to open to create that connection because you're about to give them a whole lot of heavy stuff. And it was really transformative. So it really helped my anxiety too, because I liked the story. And so I knew I could tell. So talk us through that process.
Yeah, and that last thing you just said, so important. If you love the story that you're going to tell, it makes all of that so much easier because we stories are an exchange of energy. And when you have
Mm,
interest and excitement towards it, that comes through. So the key is you have to be choosing stories that you like. But before you ever choose a story, you have to start with your audience. And it's where we started this, right? Because it's not what you want to say. Otherwise, you're just like that uncle at the holiday table that is just telling the same story again and again. And he's telling it for himself. Like, you're all there mouthing along in your seat. Like, we've heard this so many
I
times.
mean, I love my husband, but God help me.
You
We've
love
been
him.
married for 17 years and together longer. And I'm like, when the story starts, I'm like, literally, I'm like,
Yep.
I'm sorry, I'm mouthing if you tell me, and I'm
Yeah.
like, "Oh my God."
My husband and I have a secret agreement that when we get to the point of we're repeating our stories like we hear family do, we have to stop them. Like, we've
Kick them under
crossed
the
over that
table.
age. We can't do this anymore. But those stories aren't about you. They're about the person telling it. And that's where storytelling can go wrong. If you're focused only on this story you want to tell that you love and you haven't stopped to think about who am I talking to and what do I want them to feel? What do I want them to know or do differently? How do I want them to think differently? Then your story is not going to resonate. But whether you know the idea you have or not, you always want to start there and get grounded on who is this that I'm talking to?
Yeah.
Where is their mindset today? Where am I trying to get them to? What does that feel like for them? What do I want them to know, do, or think different? And
Do you
what might
write
be
this out? Do you sort of like block it out?
I do like a sentence. So I will write a sentence for roughly each of these. So what do you want them to think or feel? Write a sentence out. What do you
Mhm.
want them to know or do? Write a sentence out. What is their mindset today? Write a sentence out. And then what might be an obstacle?
Mm.
So at the end of this, you have what do you want them to know, think, feel, do, where their mindset is today, and an obstacle. And that's grounding you in who am I talking to? Because whether it's one on one or a ballroom full of people, you want to feel like you're talking to someone across the table. We all want to
Mhm.
hear it that way. Once you get that and you really spent time thinking it through, and I don't mean hours, I mean you've given it consideration, which it could be generally 5 minutes, you then can work through what are ideas that I have that will help me build this idea, do this thing that I want for this audience. So if we take the Shrek medley example, that wouldn't necessarily have been top of the list until that concert and everybody's doing the YMCA, and I realized like, oh yeah, it's all about what people feel. And
Yeah.
so in that case, I would think like, what's a story where I can demonstrate that how you leave people feel when you're communicating is probably more important than what you say. And that's like, oh yeah, this Shrek medley that I will be forever plagued by. You start to think through that, and then you can start to play and build out a basic structure.
You also say stories can slow a no. I think that I wrote it down.
Yeah.
How does
So
I love that.
yeah, I spent my before I opened my company, I spent my career working as a head of culture in a business at General Electric, a chief learning officer, a head of leadership development in a business in Deloitte. And so I've always been in these roles where I'm trying to convince many people, I'm trying to convince one or two people to make investments in technology and development and different programs. And one or two people have the budget and the ability to say yes, yet 99 people could say no and stop things. And so you're not just trying to persuade the decision maker, you're trying to get all of the people around to not only slow their no, but to come along and be persuaded by what you're sharing so that they can help influence the decision makers. And so what I found is that stories are such a great way to do that, because if you're just presenting information, it's a yes or no and people want to move on. But when you tell a story, people start to engage with that differently. It opens up a different conversation, and it's not the immediate no. And you crack in the space for some oxygen. It's like when you're building a fire, you need the space between the logs for oxygen. That's what the story does. It becomes the space between
Hmm,
the logs that allows more oxygen to come in and allows for you to make some shifts.
I love that. My last question for you is about breath and preparation. I would love
Mm.
you to talk us through, for a lot of us, the most anxiety producing moment is that hour before or the morning. We have a speech at 10 or we have a presentation
Yeah.
at 10. We wake up, that whole morning is just, we're just nerves. We're just, what's the right way to think about the morning and then the 10 minutes before we go and lead?
Yeah. The nerves may always be there. You may
Yeah.
never get to a point where you're like, "Oh, got that solved. Let's,
No.
go have fun." Um, the way I like to think about it, because I started in my career hating public speaking. In fact, my husband saw this photo of me in my first job where I had to get up and give a speech, and I don't think I was prepared. I didn't know in advance I was going to have to, and it probably wouldn't have mattered anyway. But I was like gripping my hands so tight that they were white, and I just looked so awkward. And in this photo, he saw it and he said, You look like you're talking about protons and neutrons and not in a good way.
Oh no.
So I always remember that. And I was like everyone, oh my gosh, I'm a terrible speaker. I shouldn't do this. This is so awful. And what I didn't know is there are things to learn. This isn't about like doing what feels right in the moment and trying, like you're not Fozzie Bear on stage going waka waka waka. It's about planning, and there's an arc and a structure and the way you use your voice and your gestures. And so once I started to learn that, I realized, oh, this is sharing information at scale, because I love to give people information, help them be prepared, and give them the runway to be successful. So for me, giving a keynote, it is never about me on stage. It's about sharing this information at scale and watching it go. So first is your mindset of, this is about you or is this about them? Because if you can focus on them, it's key. Then there are certain tricks you can do. There's some research that says when you are feeling amped, if you step forward, if you have forward movement in these moments of feeling amped, you get this free dopamine release. And it's like your brain says, congratulations, you did something hard. Here you go.
Oh,
And
wow.
so much of it is like, how do you incorporate some type of movement in your first sentence where you're moving forward and you're moving your arms? Because that's going to help move some of that energy around. And the faster you get some of that energy moving, the more you can focus on what's being said. So it is truly like, know your opening sentence rock solid and have one or two pieces of movement in there to help move that energy around.
I
And
love
then
that.
do that throughout their talk.
That makes sense. It really
Mhm.
does. I mean, I think for me, one of the biggest challenges is, I'm sorry, I'm moving. You might be able to hear that, but I um my breath gets real tight up in my chest, and then I have to keep going. And so I'm talking and I'm going, and so I have really tried to work on like relaxing my front carriage and just like pushing
Mhm.
my breath down a little bit more, because I don't want to be all wheezy, wheezy when I talk.
But here's the trick also. If your hands are at your side in what I call T-Rex arms, so your elbows are glued to your waist and you move your hands, but your elbows don't move, you're actually cheating your lungs of oxygen. Because if
Oh,
you raise your arms, you're creating a little bit of space between your ribs, you're helping lift your whole diaphragm, you're allowing more space in there for your lungs. Sometimes the breath is really hard. If you find you get really nervous, it's almost like a musician. You want to plan out like, okay, say shorter fragments, figure out
mm.
where you're going to breathe. Like I feel like I just went through this reading my audiobook. I don't know if you experienced it, but I
Never
was
been
like,
able to.
you
Never been
haven't.
able to read
Okay.
it.
Well,
No.
I learned I write in really long sentences and you're on the fly trying to make choices of where you breathe and how do I say this without running out of air and sounding like an idiot. And so it's sometimes it's how do I speak in phrases and use that to my advantage, because I can use a phrase to build cadence. I can use a
Yes.
phrase to work in pause. I can use a phrase for inflection. I can use a phrase to turn my head and change where I'm looking. Like you mix it up, because all of these things then become choices that impact the experience. The worst thing you could do is not move, not gesture, not look at anyone, speak in a monotone, get through it as fast as possible, get off stage and think, I did it.
I did it. It's done.
Instead, just try to be you, because people will respond to that. No one expects perfection. No one expects a flawless, eloquent thing, but they do want to hear what you have to say. And your audience is there rooting for you. I have not seen an audience boo anyone off stage. I know that happens in comedy clubs and other places, but for most of us, the places we're speaking are for incredibly supportive people that want to hear what you have to say and they're cheering you on.
Oh God, I gave a talk recently and the slide thing wasn't working. So I was basically unable to see. I use visual slides just
Yeah,
to keep me
same.
oriented. And I was so anxious about it. And about 3/4 of the way in the speech, I said to the audience, y'all, like, this whole speech, I've been so anxious because I've never done a talk like this where I have no orientation in space about, and I'm doing it, and I'm really proud of it, but I've been anxious about it. And it was like the air in the room right? Because I kept having to say to the deck, like, next slide, please. And then sometimes it wouldn't move. And I'd say, next slide. And it was like a weird experience. So one of the things that I've learned, again, as someone who tries to be vulnerable with my audience, especially given what I talk about, is like, sometimes everybody will have had this experience where you have the clicker and the clicker doesn't work.
Yeah, sure.
And you're trying to advance your slide and the clicker's not. And like, I will say now, if that is a good 15 minutes of that happening, I was like, guys, like, the clicker is stressing me out. Is the clicker stressing you out? And they're like, yes. And then everyone's like, ah, and then we can
Right.
move on. And
Yeah,
so I think part of what you're saying is that you have to be you.
you do.
And even though you're up there performing, is it okay to sometimes like break that fourth wall?
It's not only okay, it's needed. So I
Yeah.
am a fan of Sting. I think he's an amazing musician with the Police on his own, have followed him for years. And I was getting the chance to see Sting in concert for the first time not long after I graduated university. So excited. He was the soundtrack to so many of my high school and college days. And I was excited not just to hear the music, but to hear Sting as a person.
Yeah.
And I
I
go and
know.
it had poured all day, and we're like sitting on trash bags on the lawn because I was still at an age where I would buy lawn seats and sit on them. And he comes out, everyone's crazy. Hello, plays his songs. At the end, he's like, good night. And nothing else. And I was so defeated. Now, I just heard an amazing Sting concert. I heard this world-class musician, and I got to enjoy his songs. And technically, he owes me nothing more. But what do we love when we go to concerts? We love when someone says something about the song, or they laugh about something not working on stage, or
Oh
they tell
God.
us anything about how it was written, or that they're feeling awkward, or what they ate for lunch, because you feel like you're getting something special in that moment, because that is how you feel. We remember what we feel. And so it's not just the same thing like when you're having a meeting. So I was coaching a leader that was getting ready to do an offsite and was really concerned about what can I share and what can't I share and how do I do this? And I'm like, you're going to share what you can share, and that's fine, but make sure people get a piece of you. And that doesn't mean you're sharing all the things you can't share. Talk about what you're struggling with. Talk about
Mhm.
what you're wishing for the group. Take them behind the scenes and let them see how you made the song, because that is going to create the shift. And so when you do that on stage and you take people behind the scenes and show them a little bit of how the song is made, they will always remember that, versus me still sour about, which by the way, I've seen him in concert again and everyone's verified this, still same thing. And he owes no one anything, but holy moly, if the man just told us anything, we would all be even
You'd be
more adoring of him and his
oh my
music.
I love that. Tanya has a good question I'm gonna put up. How do you handle when you're put on the spot to say something? How do you start? Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah. So what happens in that moment, right? Your brain is like, oh, danger, danger. Everyone's looking at you. Something's not right. And you get a little extra cortisol and adrenaline. And so right away, recognize that you are not going to have the most clear thinking in that moment as when you're relaxed. It is completely fine to take a moment and say, let me give that a moment of thought. We want to always respond right away, but you're also allowed to take a moment and think about it. By the way, when you hear people that say, look, and then they rattle something off, or listen, they are defensive. And that's their verbal pause instead of taking a moment to stop, think
Mhm.
about what they want to say and move forward.
Or you could ask like, "Okay, let me make sure I heard you right.
Yep.
Could you" because then you're slowing down time and giving yourself a little minute while
Yep.
they're
My
yeah.
other favorite, and this is not a bottle of water, but I get a bottle of water with a top. I always encourage people to do this in job interviews. If it feels uncomfortable to say, let me take a moment to think about that, pick up your bottle, unscrew the top,
Yeah.
take a drink, because you're buying yourself time with unscrewing and putting it down and having that moment. So first is to just recognize this is, I'm going to take a moment to think about it. I love to give myself the cue of, what do I think about this? Are there 3 things I think about this? And it just primes my brain. What is one thing I think about
Mm.
this? Because it goes from your brain feeling flooded to, is there one thing?
Mhm.
In improv, they teach this. What is one thing you can bring to the scene? And so you don't worry about the full scene and where it's going. You're bringing that one thing. So pause, cue your brain to say, is there one thing you can bring? What do you think about it? What are 3 things? And start to put stuff together. I told you I'm an introvert. I will often tell people, this isn't fully baked. I'm still thinking through this, and I'm going to get my best idea 20 minutes after we get off. So you may get a
I will
follow up
say
later.
I'm an introvert. And did you know introverts have a harder time with brainstorming on the spot?
So here's my suggestion on that, because while that is 100% true, and this is coming from an introvert, what I find resonates better
Mhm.
is not the defensive stance of, this is hard for me as an introvert, but more, I'm still thinking this through, or I'm still processing. I'm probably going to get my best
That
idea
is
once we're
better.
done.
That is
It,
better.
it doesn't, it minimizes the bias, let's say,
That
that can
is
come
better.
in.
Right. Like,
Yeah.
oh, I'll never call an introvert again because they,
Right.
yeah.
Instead, you're trying to say, look, I have something to say here, but recognize you are not getting the most thought out thing here, and you're going to get a better idea. I may come back to you.
I actually like that. I personally, and I think as women also, we don't get hurt as much.
Yeah.
And so what I have learned is I will talk, but I'll say that and then I'll use it as an excuse to write my thoughts later, which I know, given who I am, are going to be much better and more eloquent. And so I think that and I just saw a piece of research, you probably know this research, that showed that people who are able to take a confident silence in a meeting are given a lot of credence and respect if they own that silence, because it lets the other people know, well, this person is secure enough in their thoughts to give this a minute.
The research I heard years ago that I love is that if you were asking a question and you then count 1,000, 1,000, by the time you get to 10, someone will have chimed in, because people hate discomfort. I don't. And once I learned that, and we flipped it, right? We're talking about if someone's asking a question. But once I learned that, I recognized, wow, okay. So now I can outweigh a group. And that doesn't, if I'm working with people and there's some awkward moments, I can outweigh them. Knowing that on the flip side of, it's okay for you to take those seconds, and maybe other people start to get a little uncomfortable, but it does say, like, oh, wow, they're not rushing their thought here. That's great. That's a very positive thing.
I hope that's helpful, Tanya. Outweigh the room. I love that. I'm going to practice that. Well, Karen, I wish you best of luck in your book launch.
Thank you.
This is a really exciting time, and thanks for sharing your wisdom here today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.